Hello and welcome to our live webcast, Decoding the Latest Procure to Pay Benchmarks, Know the Secret Behind the Leading Procurement Teams. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Don, and I'll be the operator for today's presentation. Before we get things started, I'd like to take a moment or two to acquaint you with a few features of this web event technology. At any time, you may adjust your audio using any computer volume settings that you may have. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see the Q&A window. There's a large window which holds all of your sent messages and a smaller text box at the bottom where you'll type your questions. To send us a question, click in the text box and type your text. When finished, click the Send button. We are joined today by our speakers, Richard Waugh, VP Corporate Development of Zycus. Richard has an extensive background in B2B e-commerce. He helped launch GE's Trading Process Network, the first online marketplace for sourcing and procurement. Also joining us today, Amy Fong. Amy is Purchase-to-Pay Program Leader and Senior Procurement Advisor for the Hackett Group. Ms. Fong is an advisor for Hackett Group's Procurement Executive Advisory Program and brings 19 years of experience in both industry and consulting with a focus on procurement, supply chain, and organizational effectiveness. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn the audience over to you, Amy, to begin today's presentation.
Yeah, that's great. And this is Richard. Actually, I guess before Amy launches here, I'll just take 30 seconds real quickly to acquaint folks who may not already be familiar with Zycus as to where we fit in the marketplace. Zycus is a comprehensive source-to-pay suite, so encompassing everything from spend analytics through sourcing, contract and supplier management from an upstream perspective, and really the focus of today, procure-to-pay, e-procurement and e-invoicing, and we sort of wrap that entire integrated suite together with a financial savings management capability to demonstrate the results to the business. So that's our perspective, and without further ado, Amy, why don't you get us started here with digital purchase-to-pay?
Thanks a lot, Richard, and thanks for having me here today. So Richard asked to talk about the trends in the purchase-to-pay space, and what we've really seen over the last several years and going forward is this transition, or transformation, I should say, of the enterprise to a digital ecosystem. And that means a lot of different things when you look at your company or your organization at the senior level and at the broader market level. But what I like to do is take that down to what does it really mean for a purchase-to-pay organization. When we look at how do we capitalize as P2P leaders on the digital opportunity. And this is our Hackett digital transformation model, starting with, at the top level, you need to have your process or your group, your function, your business unit aligned to the enterprise and the key business functions and their digital strategy. From that, you're typically going to have a functional strategy for procurement and often for finance, and P2P somehow sits usually in the middle of that. So those of you familiar with how we view the P2P process, typically the purchasing operations, transactional is part of procurement. Your accounts payable is part of finance, although there are a lot of variations, and we strongly believe that you need to coordinate across the two. With a cross-functional process like this, you're really aligning to probably two digital strategies when it comes down to us. So what does that mean? What kind of capabilities do we need to build in our P2P process? Well, there are 4 or 5 really main areas that we believe we need to optimize to be a digital P2P organization. And the foundation is analytics-driven business insight with customer engagement and personalization, digital service and process optimization, an ecosystem of network solutions, and compliance. And I'm going to talk through those today. Underlying all that is your partner capabilities, the IT capabilities, the technology that you use that foundationally supports all of this. So just as a little bit of a background, I mentioned the P2P process. When we view that, we look at the green is the purchasing ops part, the bluish color here is the accounts payable. I'm going to talk a lot today about our relatively recent purchase-to-pay study. We do this study every couple of years, so it enables us to look at trends and changes across the purchase-to-pay landscape, what top performance looks like. I'll talk in a second about how we define top performers. But looking at over the course of a year, some of the key cost metrics, some of the key efficiency and effectiveness metrics. And in this presentation, you'll notice that we jump around across different activity areas. So master data, purchasing, payables, P-card, and working capital. All of those are related to the P2P process. There's some highlighting at the top of the slides in here that'll tie in which one we're talking about. If you're really focused on one of those areas, you might want to, jump through the slides when you get them to focus on the metrics that fall into that specific area. But as I said, I'm a strong believer in the end-to-end process, and looking at all of these really is important. So for those of you not familiar with Hackett, we have a world-class or a top performer methodology. When we look at top performers, when we look at a process like P2P, we look at the top performers by breaking out a set of key metrics around efficiency and effectiveness. And this is just an example of what some of those metrics are. Efficiency is, how quick you can do things, how cost-effective, cost per transaction, cycle time, things like that, level of automation. Effectiveness is how well you do something. So your first pass match rate would be an indicator of that. Your transaction strategy being streamlined, your visibility into spend, and various other measurements that we have in the study. Every company that goes through this gets plotted across this giant formula. It's fairly complex of all of these different metrics and plotted on this grid that we call the value grid. Those in the top quartile on both efficiency and effectiveness are considered top performers. So you'll see me refer to top performer metrics. That's really from a group of companies. They are good across the board. We're not looking at top quartile on an individual metric, for instance. We're looking at the highest performing companies from a balanced scorecard and how they perform on this metric. So just something to keep in mind to understand some of what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to jump into the first of these digital capabilities, and the one that I'll start by saying I feel like gets lost a little bit. Often when we talk about digital transformation, people think technology. It's not just technology. It's the whole service delivery model. It's your talent. It's your information and your data flowing through that technology, and it's also a customer-centric viewpoint. So digital customer engagement and personalization is really how that trickles down into the P2P process. And what we found is that over the last couple of years, nearly 90% of companies that we talk to have some kind of plans to streamline their P2P policies, and customer satisfaction is actually one of the leading reasons they did that, or that they are doing that. Another reason that I think is kind of interesting that comes up a lot is that as you go to implement technology, you tend to see, hey, our policies, when we're putting this in the system, it's kind of old and doesn't really make sense. So we need to make this a little more streamlined. We need to update this. So there's that. There's also, just addressing behaviors that are kind of allowed but aren't really the intent of the policy, and just a lot of cleanup happening. 90%, though, is a pretty high number of companies that are looking at this. Just hit that. What we find, though, is that, there's several different tactics people are taking. One is clarifying roles and responsibilities. That's probably the most common tactic that we've seen, as well as doing training to their users on how to engage with the P2P process, and clarifying really the definition of their tools. So helping people understand, when do I use a P card? When do I go to a catalog? When do I need to call a buyer for an assisted buy? When do I have to go to sourcing? The interesting thing about this, though, is that there's actually not as much focus on the customer in this as you would think. We found that only 19% of these companies said that they were convening an internal customer council to solicit and vet their policy changes. So it's almost like, if you want to change behavior, you need to go to the source and ask the people whose behavior you're trying to change. So I think that's an important takeaway as we look at policy. Intuitive self-buying. So one thing that we talk a lot about is the ability to drive requisitioners to the buy pay channel that you are hoping to get them to go through. This is a key focus of guided buying. Richard will talk about this in a second, but it's a really important part of stakeholder satisfaction and driving compliance. What we found is that the top performers we work with are significantly better at driving people to buy pay channels that have been established. They say, almost all of them say they're either very effective or they're mostly effective at doing this, whereas average companies don't. And this is a challenge, right? There's several steps to be good at this. First of all, you need to know what your buy pay channels are, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes, but really having an established process for how you want people to go through each step, how to requisition, how to purchase, how to receive, how to invoice, all of that, so that you can drive them through the right channels. And it's quite a differentiator. And I'll let Richard jump in on this one.
Yeah, Amy, I think you've got, so many great insights from this study, from the data that you've been able to compile, and I wanted to have a chance to comment on a couple of those as we go through here. And the first one that struck me from the slides you just presented was this significant disparity between those top performers and the peer group overall, in terms of 44% of the top performers said they're very effective at being able to drive requisitioners to the preferred buy pay channel, just 11% for the peer group overall. So top performers more than 3 times as likely, or 3 times more likely, to say we're very effective at doing this. So it kind of prompts the rhetorical question, at least in my mind, what best practices might account for this disparity? And I wanted to shed some light on sort of a quick tutorial on guided buying. How does this work, after all? How can top performers be so much more effective at driving compliance, driving requisitioners to the preferred buy pay channel? And for me, anyway, I think the moment of truth starts when that user first logs in to a Procure-to-Pay or Purchase-to-Pay platform and does a search and really, can I find the product or service that I need to buy quickly? Because after all, if I don't, maybe I won't come back again. So that's going to affect my adoption overall. So guided buying is really the notion that we need to empower end user requisitioners, and we can't presuppose that they're knowledgeable procurement people. In fact, they're not. They come from all different functional groups. They're doing this just to get that good or service that they need to complete their project or their job. So it starts at the initial search. And one of the key capabilities, the innovations in the area of guided buying, is let users be able to do their search based on a natural language search term. So don't assume that users should know what the proper category name is for something that I want to buy. So just a quick example here. I'm looking for a screwdriver. Well, I don't know that the proper category may be a power tool, for example, but if you have a guided buying platform that has this intelligence built in, it actually uses artificial intelligence that can then prompt the user for the correct category code. And, so it really starts right at that moment of truth. As I said, I can find what I need. I can find relevant search results based on the appropriate category. And the other thing, of course, we want to accomplish here is not just to make it easy for users, but make sure that we make it easy for them to do the right thing, meaning a compliant purchase. So if I can drive the user to the correct category, let's say it's power tools in this case, then a guided buying platform can say, and here are your 2 preferred vendors that we have negotiated agreements with for this type of product, so that you're not inviting the potential for that dreaded maverick purchase. They're selecting from your pre-approved vendors. And you really simplify the entire workflow for that end user, because if you can apply this sort of artificial intelligence, the system knows that based on the category that I'm purchasing, maybe on the dollar amount of the item that I've selected, what is the appropriate category-specific workflow? What is the approval chain required to approve that purchase? And it takes care of all that back-end accounting for me as well. So if I know the category, I can map it to the correct general ledger account, and All of my information in terms of the bill to and ship to is defaulted on my behalf. All I have to do is check out and go. So just sort of a quick tutorial, as I said, on how guided buying can help those top performers, in fact, become very effective at driving the users to the appropriate buy pay channel. Back to you, Amy.
Thanks, Richard. That's a great example. It's really helpful to hear, to see kind of the true examples of how this actually plays out. And I agree, as you've heard me say before, that making it really easy to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing is kind of the trick to this. There's no magic to that, but blocking those channels that you don't want people on and making it super easy for them to buy the way you want them to buy is kind of the longer term, goal there. So I want to take a look at a couple of other metrics that are pretty meaningful around customer focus and stakeholder enablement, and definitely looking at a streamlined invoice approval environment. So when we look at how people are tracking invoice verification, we hope to see that most are doing some kind of workflow system. And the top performer method there really is to have 100% digital invoices coming in and a rules-based approval process with some kind of automated, we call it polite nudges for stakeholders to remind them to follow up. So, not only are we receiving things electronically, we're processing them electronically, but we also have automated reminders to keep things moving through the process. And we do find that when we look at within those that are using imaging as well, there's a significant number who are imaging specifically for their approval workflow, not just for storage reasons. Catalogs, when we look at the upfront step of purchasing, are also really important. This is how we empower users, and Richard gave some great examples. This is how we empower users to choose from pre-negotiated items at the price that we want, in the assortment that we want, from the suppliers that we want. And top performers have proven themselves to be much better at using e-catalog transactions or implementing e-catalogs. We find that they have about almost 50% of their indirect transactions going through a catalog. Now, I noticed that I said transactions, not spend. Spend is much lower. Catalogs tend to be great for those high volume, frequent buys that may not be super pricey. You probably don't have to go through a sourcing process. You're going to repeatedly buy the same kind of things. And the metric on the right here really is a meaningful one to me. When we look at catalog versus free text content for your indirect requisitions, so the goal here is to get as much on the catalogs as your users need. And what we found is that the top performing companies in our database are better at anticipating what their requisitioners need and putting that on a catalog versus, having them have to do a free text. Free text is almost always less efficient than just picking something that's already been negotiated and shopped for. I do believe that with advanced analytics, there's more potential to get this right, to look at what your requisitioners are buying and update your catalogs accordingly.
Yeah, so Amy, again, I thought the data you just showed was extremely revealing. I was in particular struck by the fact that even the best of the best, those top performers, are only capturing 15% of the indirect spend through catalog-based purchases, significantly lower, obviously, for the peer group overall, and certainly a higher percentage of the transactions, since many of those catalog-based purchases are going to be the high-volume, low-dollar type of transactions, but still just 15% of spend. So, oftentimes I think we've viewed catalog-based buying through P2P systems as the holy grail, and certainly that it introduces sort of a maximum efficiency to the process. So it ought to be therefore maximized, get as much spend going through catalogs as possible. But nevertheless, if I'm a top performer, I still got 85% of my indirect spend that's not going to go on catalogs. So that really is a drop in the bucket in some respects. I wanted to share some thoughts about how that process can be effectively addressed, the non-catalog requisition, and sort of somewhere finding the happy medium, if you will, between the catalog purchase and a completely blank free form or free text requisition. And here the notion is that based on the user search, if I can, again, assign the correct category to it, why not present them with a pre-configured category-specific electronic form instead of that truly blank free form text, which sort of invites either a non-compliant purchase or at least some inaccuracies in the data. If I can present the user with a variety of available pre-configured electronic forms such that if I'm requisitioning for cleaning and janitorial services or temporary labor, as shown in this particular example, at least prompt the user for the required attributes or specifications in my requisition based on the type of commodity that I'm asking for. So if it's temp labor, tell me how many years of experience, what type of job skills I need, what's the period of performance required, just as an example, and remove that guesswork for the end user. And I think that the companion to that then, too, is in lieu of a catalog, how can I integrate contracts in the P2P process, especially for those services, sort of non-catalog requisitions? The contracts will tell me a lot of the information that I may have found in a catalog. What are the negotiated rates or terms and conditions associated with this, and present that to the user at the point of requisition so that they don't have to go fumbling around. They can, quickly and efficiently complete a non-catalog requisition as they would for a catalog-based requisition, and really drive that compliance throughout. So be able to, by virtue of integrating contracts into the requisitioning process, reference the correct contract in the PO that's produced. That's going to drive more efficiency on the back end when I go to match that PO against the invoice for a payment on either a two-way or three-way match basis. So again, just wanted to share some thoughts on that perspective as I turn things back to you, Amy.
Thanks, Richard. And I saw a question come in that I think is really relevant to the last slide, so I'm going to throw it out there to you. Somebody was asking if what you're showing is based on the requester's profile for the search. I believe that is the case, but can you confirm that?
It is. I mean, that's a great question, because when we talk about compliance, in many organizations that means, too, not only do I only want to present the requisitioners with approved contracted vendors for their category, but it should be a category that they have, authorization to be buying in the first place, right? So if I can set those business rules, as you can in these systems, based on that user's persona, if you will, where are they in the organization, what is their role, what should they have access to, then you can tailor that user experience based on, all of those factors as well. So great question, and absolutely that's part of this whole notion of guided buying is that sort of personalization as well.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And I think that personalization is really, when we talk about that first piece of customer engagement and personalization, it's really making it easy for people to find. And if they have 100 categories in front of them, that's confusing. If they have, the 5 things that really fall into their job in front of them, that's much easier interface to work with. So I think that's a key feature. I'm going to jump into the next section now, talk about digital service and process optimization. And when we talk about, digital service and processes, we're just talking in general about how we do things, how we optimize those, we become more efficient. We talked a little bit about channel strategy. And for those of you who are not as familiar with that, what we're really talking about is going through the whole process of everything from source to pay and deciding how you want people to execute on each step based on the category that you're buying from. But the way that we start that is really looking at the buy pay approval methods that are required or needed for the type of spend that you have based on the risks of that spend. And what we're looking for is a balance of efficiency and control. You don't want to overmanage your buys. You don't want to have everything necessarily on a three-way match if you don't need to. Looking at a three-way match where you have a purchase order, receipt, invoice, and then payment, that's a pretty inefficient way to approve spend. Now, we certainly need that level of control on some categories. We need that invoice. We need to match it against a receipt. We need to record that it's in inventory. We need to PO for purchasing approval up front before we buy. But it's we look at really a balance of, for the efficiency side, putting as many transactions as possible on two-way match, things like assumed receipt, ERS, recurring invoice, even on P cards where, those are not necessarily as controlled, but they're very efficient purchases. And T&E reports, of course, falls in there as well. So we're looking from a percent of line items transactional to be as efficient as possible, from a percent of spend to be as controlled as possible for the most amount of spend. So you don't want to put your big buy, high-risk items on the P card necessarily, but you do maybe want to streamline your low-dollar, high-transaction, high-volume type items with some of the tools that we've talked about. What we find is that top performers have about 42% of line items through those transactional efficient channels, whereas peers only have about 24%. So when we work with companies, I think really looking at this channel strategy, building out what you want that to be, what your vision is, and then putting in the right tools to enable it is really key. That's a foundational thing that I'm working with a lot of companies as they're looking to, streamline their processes and increase their efficiency. And Richard, your thoughts on that?
I have some, but we also have some great questions coming in. I thought before I launch into this next
go ahead.
Problem statement, as you introduced the different buy pay channels in the prior slide, one question that came to the fore here is that tail spend, and P card has certainly been one of the tools that's been used to manage, but the question is sort of what other tools are top performers using to manage tail spend? And one of the best practices that I've seen is certainly wherever I have enough volume in terms of the categories that I buy, I want to have my own kind of negotiated catalogs or contracts visible to end users so that they're buying off of those negotiated agreements where I can, again, leverage that spend volume and reap the benefits. But there are certainly categories in the tail spend area where I simply don't have enough volume. Doesn't make sense for me to manage that strategically from a category management standpoint or even put in place contracts. So in lieu of the P cards, and I think the reluctance to use P cards has sometimes been giving up control, sort of letting the users buy whatever they want, at least within the dollar threshold limits of the P card. Certainly one of the strategies is, having something like, and I know we've done this, and being able to, once the users do an initial search, and if they can't find an approved contracted vendor on catalog or on contract in the system, being able to punch out to something like Amazon for Business. Because even though it's a low volume tail spend transaction, I still want to make sure that it's within the workflow of my P2P process, that I have the advantage of making sure those requisitions go through the appropriate approval channels on the front end, and I can, do the matching of the invoices on the back end. So certainly that's one area where we've seen companies, adopting a strategy for tail spend, and I'm sure you may have some comments as well, Amy.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like anything I talk about these days, I just wait for that tail spend question to come up because it's such a big challenge. We've had a lot of interest in that topic lately. And, it shows a level of maturity. We've gotten through sourcing and managing a lot of our more strategic suppliers, but what do we do with this long tail? And understand that P cards are one solution. You mentioned some of the others. I think depending on the type of spend, it's typically a multi-pronged solution. And I'm working with a company now where they have a lot of tail spend on the direct side, and they're in A&D, so it's fairly sensitive. And they're looking at a strategy that combines P cards with VMI with things like outsourcing of a tactical buying desk for their low dollar spend. Definitely see kind of tactical sourcing buy desks coming into play here, as well as some of the tools you mentioned like Amazon Business or Alibaba or eBay or other controlled type marketplaces that still give a little bit of, guardrails, but let people go out and just make a quick purchase decision without a lot of investment. So it's a really interesting area. We're seeing the technology evolve there. I do think that you need to understand what your tail spend looks like and start to kind of put together a multi-pronged approach to address it. I do see another question here, Richard, around what is ERS, just to clarify my last slide. ERS is Evaluated Receipt Settlement. That is a two-way match format where you basically pay based on receipt. So it's used a lot in manufacturing or a lot in some manufacturing environments where you have a PO, and as things come in, you receive them, and then you immediately pay the supplier based on the predetermined price. It's much more efficient. You're not even processing an invoice at all, so it's a form of invoice elimination.
Yes, and actually a great segue, because the other thing that stuck out for me as you went through the buy pay channels was that the best practice here implemented by the top performers is to really balancing control with efficiency, and that means not always doing a three-way match. So ERS being one example of a certain type of purchase, certainly certain categories, some of the MRO and those kinds of things where it may be very appropriate to do that two-way match based on ERS. But, it really pointed out for me if that's the best practice, to be able to optimize based on a set of business rules, for instance, category by category, what's the right process? Is it a three-way or two-way match? That implies I need to have a highly configurable workflow capability to differentiate between, a certain buy-pay process for one category versus another. And that really means that I need to be able to configure those rules based on what am I buying? Is this OPEX or CAPEX? Is it a project-related expense? What's the nature of the category? Maybe what is the dollar threshold, or where I sit in the hierarchy of the organization at a business unit or geography or department level. So just to kind of give a view of how the technology can enable that from a highly configurable workflow standpoint. If we had to go in and essentially hard code all of these workflows and get an IT resource to develop those kinds of things, we may be talking about several months of effort to do that. And the breakthrough, if you will, is to be able to do sort of an on-screen workflow configuration in a drag-and-drop way. So even a non-technical user could very easily configure these type of workflows, and with a set of drop-downs, simply identify what is the business rule based on the purchase type or the category of the dollar amount, and really mask that complexity to the end user. So they don't have to think about what's the right path. The system knows based on what I'm buying and who I am and how much I'm spending, perhaps, what the approval path needs to be to optimize that process. And it's, from the end user standpoint, then I just want visibility. So when I click I'm done or check out with my requisition, show me in a graphical way what is the approval chain that requisition is going to follow, give me status updates to see where it is, so I can get back to my job and be confident that I've completed that transaction successfully and I've got some visibility to the status going forward. So just another example there of enabling some of those best practices. Once again, back to you, Amy.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, great example there, and that's a nice, easy way to configure that workflow. So I want to hit on now, as we're talking about process efficiency, I don't think we can cover that without talking about the automation across the whole process. And when we talk about, digital P2P, we're truly thinking about how do we get every step of that process from requisition to payment automated. And to be fair, we put in a target here of about 95 to 98%. You're always going to have that, one random thing that you have to write a check for. Not going to try to argue that it has to be 100% across the board. But as you can see, most of the companies that we look at are pretty far below that. The places that top performers and peers tend to be strong at is automation of the requisition process. Getting 80% through e-requisitions is a pretty good number, even for peers. PO change orders as well. Once the PO is electronic, we tend to be able to change it electronically. Purchase orders, though, you see this big disparity there on releasing to a blanket order or creating a PO, difference between 85% and 30% of those going out electronically to suppliers. And then invoice receipt is the other area where I see this huge disparity in terms of the percent of invoices that are coming in true electronic format, not a PDF attached to an email, but an actual, CXML, EDI type network or portal type format. And what my take on this is that a lot of companies have implemented some software and they've gotten some percent of their suppliers onboarded, but they haven't reached the level of supplier onboarding that really enables them to have, 80-90% of their invoices coming in electronically. They're kind of in a mixed hybrid type mode there, and supplier onboarding seems to be the main reason that I hear when I talk to companies. So obviously a lot of opportunity there, I think, to get to that 100% or 95% across the board. But we do see some movement in that. We've seen about 10% of e-invoicing increase, for instance, among peers in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and Amy, this is another area where, once again, I was struck really by the disparity, the size of the gap between those top performing organizations and sort of everyone else. So if top performers are generating 85% electronic POs, and that doesn't mean an email, right, Amy? That's a really no kidding,
yeah.
An electronic formatted PO. So that was 85% versus 33%, and the ability to generate an electronic PO almost guarantees that you're going to have a higher rate of adoption on the back end in terms of getting an electronic invoice back, right? Because after all, that electronic PO is the enabler for the supplier to be able to flip the lines from the PO into an electronic invoice coming back. So given the gap, the size of the disparity, it kind of prompts the question, well, what are some of the best practices that are enabling top performers to achieve such high levels of transaction automation? I just thought I'd share a quick client case study in the banking and financial services industry that was really starting with a purely manual, paper-based process and looking to go digital with purchase-to-pay. And I think one of the lessons learned, the best practices in this case, is while you may have thousands of suppliers, like most things, the Pareto works, the 80-20 rule, that and oftentimes the 20% of suppliers, your most frequently used suppliers in particular, may be generating 80% or more of the transaction volume. So in terms of enablement, I think one of the best practices really, let's focus on that sort of surgically enabling, at least in the initial wave, those 20% of suppliers that could encompass 80% or more of the transactions. So in this case, that's exactly what this client did, is apply that 80-20 rule, focus in on a group of 500 suppliers initially, and really enable them based on whatever their level of technical capability is. And once again, actually in this case, the 80-20 rule applied. So within that subset of high-volume suppliers, 20% were the larger suppliers that already were e-commerce capable, so they can collaborate through a standard protocol like CXML. But 80% were more the smaller or mid-sized vendors for whom a portal interface was perfectly sufficient. So they could just log into a portal, retrieve and confirm and acknowledge receipt of that electronic PO and flip it into an electronic invoice coming back. So 80% of those suppliers were enabled through through that portal interface that just requires a browser. And at the end of the day, of course, it produced, really dramatic benefits in terms of efficiency, certainly on the back end from an accounts payable standpoint, reducing cycle time by 40%, reducing the level of effort just from a vendor management standpoint, because I can now electronically enable these suppliers, on the order of 87% as an example. So I think big takeaway there is really segmenting the supply base, understanding and prioritizing those suppliers that are going to generate the highest volume of transactions, and then making sure that you can meet them, at whatever level of technological capability your suppliers are most proficient with to get them on board with a truly digital process. So again, let me turn it back to you, Amy.
Thanks, Richard. So let's just take a look at a couple more of these service level type process metrics, efficiency metrics. And the other way that we look at this when you're talking about some of the things that you were just covering, the automation, is looking at a per FTE basis. This is where we really see the streamlining of processes and best practice adoption and touchless processing really carrying through. When we look at the orders processed per FTE on orders, or the transactions per FTE on orders, receipts, and invoices, and you can see this huge disparity between top performers and peers here. And the way that we calculate this, just for clarification, is we don't sit down with one FTE and say, how many did you process today? We look at the number of people on the, actually doing this activity across a 12-month period, and then the number of transactions, and it's divided, right, transactions per FTE. So what that means is that the more touchless you have and the fewer FTEs you have, that being full-time equivalents, or the fewer people you have, the higher this number is going to be. And so as you're increasing your, the amount of automation, you see these jumps in efficiency. And this is really key for a couple things. The streamlining and the efficiency driving is important if you're in a growth industry, your volumes are going up. Very important if you're in a high-cost region, eliminating some of that cost from the labor, and ideally, if you're trying to elevate the maturity of your organization, moving those people to more strategic work, away from the transactional processing, maybe to sourcing or supplier management or working capital management or that kind of thing. So the next area that I want to talk about is the digital ecosystem of network solutions, and I'm just going to go through quickly kind of the last three areas here, and then we'll start to wrap up. But when we talk about network solutions, what we're really talking about is how we connect suppliers with buyers, with partners, in this digital model, which really looks a lot more like a web than like the traditional linear supply chain. When we look at how we interact, there's a couple different metrics that I think are interesting here. The first is, how we disperse payments. And what we find is that the majority of payments now are dispersed via electronic methods. That's great. That was one of those highest levels of electronic automation. But what we also find when we look at the payment process is that these financial supply chain tools are relatively low in maturity compared to the potential benefits. So I tend to look at three phases of financial supply chain maturity. The first being, we're just going to manage our payment terms. We're going to automate our invoices. And that's really foundational to moving up the maturity curve here. Most companies have done something to manage their payment terms, not necessarily standardizing to one term, but standardizing to a menu of preferred terms with their suppliers. About 70% have some kind of e-invoicing system or are using ERS. Remember, we talked earlier that doesn't necessarily mean they have all their invoices on there, but they have something in place. The next stage up is really looking at how do we negotiate savings? How do we drive efficiencies in the financial supply chain? And just to clarify, when I say financial supply chain, it's really that transactional financial transaction back and forth, the cash flow between the buyer and the supplier. early payment discounts and putting in place some kind of strategy around them is becoming more common, as all are P cards. And P cards have a lot of other benefits too, but one of them is to delay your payment and potentially increase your cash flow depending on how they're used. The most mature phase really that we see is when companies start to automate and refine their cash management using tools like dynamic discounting or supply chain financing, trade financing. And those are two areas that we still see very low adoption. We see about 20% of companies adopting both of those. And interestingly, supply chain financing has really taken off and superseded dynamic discounting when we look at the percent of adoption that's relatively new over the last couple of years. Not a new concept. I've actually been looking at companies that did financial supply chain financing for their buyers or their suppliers for probably a couple decades now, going back only in my career. But I think the ease of use with these kind of tools is making them more relevant. And I would also say because automation is so foundational to doing these efficiently, we're seeing that people have to really work their way up that curve. So I did want to touch on that piece there around the network and the payment network that we have with our suppliers. Digital compliance is the next area that I'd like to touch on. And when we talk about this is really, how do we comply both externally, drive compliance externally as well as internally, and how do we ensure the quality of the process? So these are just some of the key metrics I look at here. Operational excellence is really about quality across a lot of different parts of the P2P process. So you can look at your PO creation compliance rate. That's generally pretty high, meaning you created an accurate PO. On-time delivery rate, when you look at receiving. Invoice pre-processing, how many invoices were accepted versus returned to the supplier. Invoice processing rate would be your first pass match rate. So how many times did our receipt and our PO and our invoice all match? And then your supplier payment rate, how well did we pay on time? When we add all of those up, we see about 80% of what we're calling, there's a lot of ways to define what a perfect order is, but I think this is as good as any. If you're hitting all of these metrics, you probably have a pretty solid order and payment process. And so about 80% is what that averages out to when we add all those together. Again, looking at kind of the general population here, top performers and peers all together. And then finally, I mentioned earlier that we build this whole digital strategy and all of our capabilities on an analytics-driven business insight, meaning that we use the latest technology and analytics and big data methods to increase our agility, to increase our visibility into our spend. And there's so much interesting stuff being done here. I'm sure Richard will share a little bit more of it. But what we find that's really fundamental here from the P2P process is the visibility into spend. And the organizations that are capturing the line item detail in their P2P process are much more effective at spend analytics and driving their savings in the sourcing process, which is really upfront where their big dollars are. We find that top performers have much better visibility into the line item spend data, and that 64% of companies agree that better visibility to their indirect spend is needed. This is a real issue. I would say when you're looking at digital, people often ask me a general question, okay, we want to transform into a digital organization. Where do we start? And one of the things I always say is, master data, cleanliness of your data, the governance around it, the information management techniques, as well as getting the right talent in place and managing the change, and then putting all the technology on top of that. So I think, and of course, that stakeholder-centric view that I mentioned earlier. So I can't kind of wrap this up without talking a little bit about how important it is to have good spend data that you're managing effectively. And I'll let you hit on that point too, Richard.
Yeah, I'd like to. I mean, I think the opportunity is really so significant here. I mentioned earlier, Zycus, of course, we have an entire source-to-pay suite that includes a module specifically for spend analytics. But as we look at the way that spend analytics tools have been applied historically, it's been looking after the fact, after the transactions have already taken place, and then going back and sort of often correcting the sins of the past. Something's been miscoded or misclassified, and the spend analytics tools are then to, correctly categorize and classify the data on a retroactive basis, as I say, going back after the fact. And one of the things that's so exciting, I think, about this opportunity in digital purchase to pay is, attacking the problem at the source, getting it right the first time before that transaction actually occurs, making sure that it's correctly coded and classified. And therefore, unlike the way spend analytics has been deployed historically, which is based on some refresh frequency, which often might be a monthly or quarterly process, the other opportunity that's so compelling here is to get real-time visibility into spend instead of having to wait for those monthly or quarterly refresh cycles. So it's really a critical point, just as you've mentioned, Amy, start at the source, start with data and getting data accuracy. And again, I think as your study reveals, there's this wide disparity between what the top performers are realizing, nearly 100%. So they had 99% line item spend visibility. Everybody else is below 40%. So what accounts for this significant disparity, and what are some of the best practices? And I'd just like to share a few thoughts here, and especially as regards the purchase to pay process, where by and large end users are the ones that are completing transactions. Whenever you're relying on the natural intelligence of those end users, and I'm not denigrating them in any way, shape, or form, it's just they're not procurement professionals. So if you're asking the end user to say what is the appropriate category code for the item I'm buying, what are the odds that they're going to get it right, as opposed to leveraging a technology that doesn't rely on that natural intelligence but uses the artificial intelligence to make sure that you've assigned the correct category code. And I say make sure, increases the confidence. There's no completely fail-safe, which brings up the next point, is that while you can dramatically increase the accuracy using an artificial intelligence method of categorizing it, another fail-safe or safeguard in that process is then the actual approval routing at a line item level within that shopping cart, because after all, a shopping cart may have multiple line items from multiple suppliers, but being able to route it at a line item level to get the approval sign-off means there's another check and balance to see not only is it an appropriate purchase that I'm willing to approve, but you can look at the category and accounting distribution, the GL codes that have been assigned to make sure it's an accurate transaction. And the last takeaway that I'll offer here is, too, one of the biggest gaps from a line item visibility that I've seen historically is all those P-card transactions where the suppliers can't, support level 2, level 3 line item reporting. They just get one aggregate dollar amount on the card billing statement. Well, again, the intelligence in these systems by applying within the requisition of the shopping cart the category code, and then being able to reconcile that when the billing statement comes in on a more automated basis can make sure that, as you get to some of that tail spend as well, that you're progressively increasing the accuracy if you have the visibility down to the line item for all of your spend transactions. So let me turn it back to you for our closing thoughts as well, Amy.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. That's a great summary there of the benefits and the kind of practices around visibility. It's so important. It's so foundational. Like people talk about RPA and artificial intelligence, and if your data's not good and your process isn't automated, there's not a lot you can do. The robots aren't going to read the paper. They're not efficiently, at least. So I think that's really important. One question I get, or one, major theme that we hear a lot of is long-term, what is the impact of digital transformation to P2P? And we've done quite a bit of analysis. It's fairly interesting to look at, as we look at, say, things like RPA, robotic process automation, how will that affect the P2P process? I kind of break it out into 3 different areas. What we will see is a lot of the rule-based routine transactions, transactional processes being reduced. They need to be automated, and then, we'll see the labor costs in those probably reduce about 40 to 50%. But we see partially repetitive and rule-based tasks reduced somewhat, not as much, where there's a lot of exception processing. I think of this as like the tactical sourcing execution kind of activities where, you're following a pretty streamlined process and you can automate portions of it, but there's still enough exceptions that you need a human doing it. And then you've got, these knowledge-centric rules across the source-to-pay process that really are not going to necessarily go away, but are going to change quite a bit. When we think about all this information and, putting it in front of a sourcing person as a category cockpit, that really changes the way that they will do their day-to-day job, for instance. And I feel that's the same across the whole, source-to-pay process, that better visibility, better information, better automation is going to change the way we do those knowledge-centric type roles. I do think we'll see that policy will be more embedded into the technologies, and you showed a couple great examples of where there's kind of that intuitive real-time guidance within a system. We'll see blockchain. People ask a lot about blockchain, and I know this isn't a blockchain webcast, but I do think we'll start see that being disruptive in terms of the e-billing and e-payment type networks where we can have a more open network there. Digitization of information, digitization of information. We're seeing that kind of create new value streams. But we're also seeing a big risk. We haven't talked a lot about the risks that companies face in here. I think that our data shows that cybersecurity is the number one risk companies are concerned about. I think that's probably a good thing because it means that they're starting to kind of buckle down and do what they need to do around cybersecurity. But we're also seeing, counter to that, I guess, or aligned with that is this instant processing concept where stakeholders are really able to get what they need in a quick way, much more instantaneously. When we think about going from Amazon Prime to Amazon Now to Amazon Fresh, right? That's how I think about my expectations changing from where they were even just a few years ago. And if they're changing as a consumer, they're changing from a business enterprise standpoint as well, and we need to keep up with that. And then I think that when we think about this information, real-time data cleansing, data enrichment, master data, transactional data, it becomes more and more important and more valuable in delivering insights and in ensuring compliance. So I'm going to wrap up on there. I know we have just a couple minutes left, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And I'll jump on this one about supply chain financing and how it works, because I did mention that term. Without getting into a really deep dive into it, supply chain financing is simply using a third party. Often it's a bank. There's a lot of third parties that will do this to kind of fund the invoice payment to the supplier. So think of it as bridging the time between when the supplier gets paid and when the buyer makes the payment. And that can be done in many cases at a lower interest rate than the supplier would be able to get on their own. So there's some advantages to, minimizing the risk to your suppliers when you extend your payment terms. There's a lot of very complicated things going on with financial supply chain tools. It's really quite interesting, but that's kind of in a nutshell how that works.
That's great, Amy. And Richard here, we've had a lot of great questions from our audience. I wanted to ask you one of my own. I've commented multiple times about how striking the disparity was in terms of the performance between top performers and everyone else. I'm just curious, there may be a number of factors, but what do you attribute the size of the gap to? Is it just the top performers are really that far ahead on their digitization? And do you think that the rest of the peer group overall will close that gap in the near future?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question. I definitely see a difference in the adoption of technology. And I don't mean, I'm going to clarify, it's not just the purchase of technology, because anyone can buy a software and put it on the shelf and not roll it out well. But when we look at how much, even in world-class companies in procurement, how much they spend on technology versus peers, it's not that they're spending a lot more in a dollar amount, it's that they have a better labor to technology ratio. So they're really displacing people with technology in a very productive way. And they actually tend to pay a little bit more for their people in many cases, but they have more skilled people doing, more effective work, and they've automated the routine processes to get that efficiency. And that's a long, long journey for some companies. We've seen, that be a tough road, but it's still, I think, one that peers will get to. We've seen so much quick evolution and revolution in the source-to-pay technology sector that I think that the solutions are there now, and it's a matter of implementing them effectively, getting customers or the stakeholders, users on board, getting your suppliers on board, and to me, that's probably the biggest differentiator that's out there.
Great insights, and it looks like we're out of time. I think we could cover this topic for several hours at least, but thank you so much, Amy, and Cami, I imagine, or Don, any closing comments as well?
All right. On behalf of the Institute for Supply Management and Zycus, I would like to thank you for your participation in today's event. That does conclude today's program. Thank you, and have a nice day.